Welcome to the Finding Financial Freedom podcast with the Frugal Physician, where Dr. Disha Spath will be your companion on this exciting financial adventure. Get ready to conquer debt, build wealth, and embrace a mindful spending lifestyle that will empower you to live life on your own terms.
Hi friends, welcome back to Finding Financial Freedom with the Frugal Physician. I'm your host, Dr. Disha Spath. Today, we've got a guest whose story is so captivating, it'll make you rethink everything you knew about finding financial independence. Our guest is Dr. Param Baladandapani, a radiologist, full-time mom, real estate mogul, and a mentor who's been there, done that, and has the real estate portfolio to prove it. Before hopping into this episode, let's imagine you're 10 years into your medical career, thinking you've got this whole financial independence thing in the bag. And then life throws you a curveball. A career hiccup here, a global pandemic there, and suddenly you're seeing your financial strategy with new eyes. That's Param's story. Starting in the stock market in 2010 and snagging her first rental in late 2013, it wasn't until a rocky career transition and the pandemic's chaos that Param had her financial epiphany. Real estate wasn't just part of her portfolio, it was her golden ticket to freedom. Fast forward through a whirlwind of learning, investing, and optimizing, and Param finds herself financially independent at 41, thanks to the cash flow from her diverse real estate investments. From industrial projects to multifamily apartments spanning across international waters, Param's not just playing the game, she's changing it. With over 1,176 doors and $210 million in assets under management. Talk about a comeback story. Now, real estate syndications have been the subject of a lot of social media grumbling recently. And the grumbling is not unwarranted. It's a high-risk game, especially as a limited partner, especially in these times. Warren Buffett said, "Investment must be rational. If you can't understand it, don't do it." So I have Param here to help us better understand syndications. And then you can decide if it's for you or not. So let's dive in. Welcome, Param.
Hey, Disha, always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm so excited to be on this podcast with you.
Oh, I'm so excited you're here. I have to tell you, Param, my mom asked me one day, she's like, "Do you know this Param?"
Oh my God.
She actually saw your Facebook ads, and she's like, "I'm thinking about investing with her. What do you think about her?" And
Oh, that's so awesome. I didn't know we had such far reach, but that's amazing.
yeah, you're doing great. And I just thought that was so funny because like she's in a totally different circle than I am, on the social media crowds. Well, anyway, I'm so glad to have you here. I've known you for a little while and I've followed your journey and you just seem to be just killing it. So can't wait to gain from your wisdom. And most importantly, I wanted to have you here today to teach us about real estate syndications. Since you're doing it, this is what you're doing full time. Really want to learn about how to evaluate a deal and how to pick out the bad ones and the good ones and that kind of thing. So let's dive in. Can you tell us in your own words what your story has been like? I kind of summarized it, but tell us where you come from.
Yeah, absolutely, Disha. I think you did a great job in terms of summarizing it. But, just to give people like a broader picture, I was doing what most people do, the traditional retirement path, investing in the stock market. I was in a high income subspecialty as a radiologist. I thought I was doing great and I was maxing out my 401 and I was investing in brokerage accounts and I had aristocrats in there. And then I transitioned to index funds. And along the way, I picked up a couple of rentals. I had a colleague who was kind of guiding me as far as real estate went. And he was like, "Oh, you should do this totally." And I looked at the cash flow, didn't think it was significant. I didn't realize how it would really impact things. And they say, if you've heard this, the breakthrough comes from the breakdown or the obstacle is actually the path. It's the opportunity. That's what happened. I had the rough transition that you talked about and created a lot of anxiety, upheaval in my personal and professional life. And I really wanted to start deep diving into financial freedom. I was like, well, after 10 years of doing the right things, I should be in a very strong position. So let me take a look at my financial freedom number. Let me look at my passive income. And I realized that after 10 years, I had about, I then learned about the 4% safe withdrawal rate. So I could only withdraw 4% from my stock bond portfolio in retirement. I was thinking it was 10% all along. And then I was like, okay, well, what does that leave me with? It left me with $2,000 a month and I needed about 10 for it to kind of meet all of my family's needs and discretionary spending, travel, all of that. So then I glanced at my real estate portfolio that I had unintentionally acquired along the way. And with a third of my money in there, I was making twice as much in passive income, right? And so this was just me being super passive, just buying a few rentals and having a property manager manage it. And so that was my aha moment. I said, well, all the earning more and saving more, and that wasn't getting me to financial freedom. It was actually being intentional about asset allocation, right? I realized that the bigger part of the puzzle was, what is the ROI? What is the return on investment of my portfolio overall? And I realized that with real estate, I could really, and I have examples on the website and an ebook that I've written, real estate could give you anywhere from 20% to 200% ROI annually. That's the power of leveraged real estate. And it's not something I understood to begin with, but as I started deep diving, I realized that. And then I was like, well, this is the big missing piece of the puzzle. It's not about earning more and, taking on extra shifts and really saving more. It was maybe going to get me to financial freedom a few years ahead of time, but I really wanted to compress those timelines. I looked at my numbers and I said 17 more years is what it would take me investing in the stock market to get to financial freedom. And I was like, I cannot do that to my family again. I can never be in this position again. So I started deep diving into more active real estate strategies. And within a year, I had a 3-year goal, but within a year, I hit financial freedom. And so that was the aha moment for me. And I said, well, more people need to be talking about this. And that's where I went into community building and built out Generational with MD and then eventually GW Capital, which is when I realized that most physicians don't want to be really active in real estate, but they do want to get to financial freedom faster. They do want to have meaningful passive income. And so GW Capital was built with the intention of bringing vetted, curated passive investment syndication opportunities to the community so they could then really still get the tax efficiencies and the higher ROI that real estate brings with it and the diversification. So they have a more resilient portfolio, but it was significantly boosting their passive income and helping them get to the point where they could make choices based on what was best for their family and practice medicine the way they want to.
A lot to unpack there. Holy cow. That's an amazing story. I kind of want to deep dive more into that turning point that you had where you decided that I never want my family to be in this position again. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Initially, it was the job transition. There was a merger. Suddenly, the terms that I had negotiated, everything was shifting. And I have family back home in India. And so vacation time was important to me. So all of that was shifting. So the security that I had from my income in medicine, I realized was almost an illusion, right? So it was only as long as I had that job. I had something else lined up, but there was a 6-month gap and I was in India for a bit. And then I was over here. My kids were in India. It was really hard. And almost a year later, we kind of settled down. Everything was back to normal. And the pandemic hit. And that was another transition for anyone who's been through it, and more so for other people than me, because as a radiologist, I did have the ability to work hybrid, part-time from home. But again, there were no nannies, no childcare. The kids were at home. I was working. I was doing a compressed work schedule because I could have more time with the kids, but I was burning myself out in the process. There was this one night, I remember exactly when I decided I had to cut down to a day a week in medicine. They were sleeping in the office with me because I felt guilty. They wanted to spend time with me. I was reading x-rays because my entire RV, the caseload had shifted. So I was reading cases and I felt like this way I'd have more time the next day to manage them while kind of working from home. And so it was midnight and I was trying to carry them out of their dinosaur sleeping bags in the office into their rooms. And I was like, this doesn't make sense anymore. But fortunately, in the interim, right, that was between that first merger and this point during the pandemic, I built my real estate portfolio to the point where I hit my financial independence number, which for me was $10,000 a month in post-tax cash flow. And I was like, you know what? I don't need to do this anymore. I can go down to a day a week in medicine because it made sense for me. And my kids were like, for 2 years after that, my son was in online school. My daughter didn't go to preschool. So I spent so much time with them and I could never have that time back again. Right now they're in school, they're in regular school. That's never coming back. But we had all these mini day trips to the beach, to the snow mountains. We go sledding. Everything is like a couple of hours from where we live, right? In Central California. That's what that gave me, right? That's the freedom that I got. That's just precious. And I wouldn't have it any other way.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, the pandemic was so difficult on all of us, especially people with kids, because not only were they not in school, you also couldn't get caretakers. So it was very hard, especially if they got sick. It's like no one's going to come over if they have any little bug. Absolutely. It was definitely tough and amazing how you went from just a couple of rental properties to getting $10,000 in passive income a month in a year. Tell us more about that. How'd you do that?
It's always a spectrum, right, Disha? And I know we were going to focus on syndication, so let me start over there. Before that, I think for most physicians investing in real estate, you're thinking about REITs, right? Real estate investment trusts. The advantage of REITs is that it's very liquid and you can start off with a small amount of money. It's almost like investing in stocks, but your returns are typically about 10% on average, which is similar to what you get in the stock market. And you're taxed on those distributions, right? So it's very tax inefficient unless you have it in a retirement account. And that's what most people think about. But for me, if you think about it, real estate to me is about boosting your ROI and kind of really getting you to meaningful passive income and financial freedom much faster, right? And so for me, the spectrum actually, I exclude REITs and crowdfunding because I think it doesn't necessarily help people with the tax efficiencies or the higher ROI that you can get with real estate. Starts off with syndications, which is like a very passive way of investing in real estate, where you get about 20% average annualized returns, right? Across different market cycles, right? On average, that's what you can expect. Going all the way up to short-term rentals, that's where you can get about 200% ROI within 6 months if you're tapping into some of those advanced tax strategies, where you kind of have to be a little more active in the portfolio. And even when you're working full-time, you're able to tap into advanced tax strategies where you can pull out all of your money in the year that you're invested in the property because you're able to shelter your W-2 income from taxes, right? And so that's how powerful it can be. But it's that effort return spectrum where you can be as passive as you want to in real estate and still get 20% average annualized returns, which is different from the 4% safe withdrawal you're getting from your stock market, and go all the way to getting 200% returns annually if you're active in your portfolio. So that's that spectrum. I decided to be more active. I call myself a hustler. I think as a real estate investor, for people listening, you can be kind of passive and stick with syndications or buying long-term rentals and handing them to a property manager, which is what I started off doing. Or you can go all in and be what I call an entrepreneur and really spend the time into building your real estate portfolio as though you were running a business. Do short-term rentals, maybe be a general partner in syndications. You can get those over 100% ROI annually if you're doing that. Or you can be somewhere in the middle where you're what I call a short-term hustler. You say, I'm going to spend a few years on this. I'm going to be really active. I'm going to do rehabs. I'm going to tap into those advanced tax strategies, either through short-term rentals or real estate professional status, and really boost my portfolio returns. And then at some point when I hit those numbers, I'm going to make that portfolio passive. And so I'm doing a short-term hustle in getting to those goals much faster, but I can, eventually get it to be super passive and go travel the world and live my life, right? So that's the spectrum. I think people can decide wherever they want to be. That's perfectly fine. You do need to educate yourself more and spend more time on your portfolio if you want those higher returns. But even when you're super passive with syndications or by owning long-term rentals where you have a property manager taking care of it, your returns are significantly higher than what you would get in the stock market, to where it really starts pushing you from, say, 20 years to financial freedom to maybe as low as, 5 to 7 years. And that's where I see the impact.
So you mentioned general partner. Can you define the general versus limited partners and how syndications are set up?
Yeah, so a syndication is essentially a group of people getting together to buy a larger piece of real estate, like an apartment complex. So you have economies of scale, but it also gives you the ability for some people to be really passive in it and just put their capital into the deal, and for other people to be more active where they're putting sweat equity into the deal, taking care of things. So the general partner, also called the sponsor or the operator, is usually someone who goes in, they find the deal, they underwrite, take a look at multiple deals, they do all of the due diligence, they find something, they lock it in, they come up with a business plan, and then work on getting together investors who will then invest in the deal passively. And then the general partners then execute the business plan, make decisions on when to exit. And so they're really taking care of the whole thing, right? That's what your sponsor does. Now, limited partners are people who want to stay very passive in real estate and still benefit from that higher return, the tax efficiencies, but they maybe want to do a little bit of due diligence, but not spend a lot of time on their portfolio, right? So they are just putting the capital in after they've done their initial due diligence, and they stay very passive on the deal. So if you're doing a little bit of due diligence, you attend a webinar, you educate yourself, you want to work with the sponsor, you want to go into the deal, you then transfer the capital. It's maybe about 2 hours of work before you're actually invested in the deal. And then you sit back, and every month you get the distributions or the returns from the deal hitting your bank account, depending on what class of investment you decide to be in. And that's about it. When the decision is made to sell, you get a share in the profit and it hits your bank account. And it's as passive as you need to be in the deal, right? So it's very time efficient for busy physicians, but it's also a way for them to kind of dip their toes and benefit from the life-changing effects of real estate. Now, the reason they're called limited partners is because they also have limited liability, because the LLC structure that holds the actual asset provides them with limited liability. Their liability is limited to their capital in the deal. So if there is a judgment, if there is a lawsuit, that cannot attach to their assets outside of the syndication. And so that's why it's called a limited partnership, or they're called limited partners.
So you highlighted very well the positives of investing in syndications. What are
Yes.
the risks? What happens when things go bad?
So that's a great question, especially in the current environment, right? Real estate is a tangible asset, and you've probably heard people say, unlike stocks, where they're paper assets, it's a real asset. The problem with any kind of leveraged real estate, which is when you get a mortgage on the property, which is typically what you're doing when you're buying something individually or you're going into this partnership structure and syndications, is that when you have leverage, your equity in the deal can be wiped out, right? And so suppose you purchase a property for, say, $10 million and you have $3 million of investor equity in the deal and $7 million of mortgage on the property. In the current environment, with interest rates going up really rapidly, what happened, and there are multiple scenarios where this happens. This happened in '07 and '08, but just talking about the most recent example, when interest rates hike up really fast, asset values drop because people don't have the ability to make those mortgage payments and pay a high premium for the property. So property values drop. Now, suppose that property, which was worth $10 million, is now only worth $7 million. What has been wiped off is investor equity, all the capital that was put into the deal by the investors, right? The limited partners. And because if you were to sell that asset at that value, then all of the $7 million goes to the lender because they have a preferential position in the capital stack. So that's how investor capital can get wiped out, right? And so with any kind of leveraged real estate, that does exist. This is what happened in '07 and '08 when people went upside down in their properties because they were giving out loans indiscriminately. People didn't have any down payment. And then when property values dropped and they were forced to sell the properties, they had no equity to begin with. They were suddenly upside down, right? Again, in the current environment, when interest rates went up, single family homes, fortunately, did not drop significantly. And that's because transaction volumes are really low. A lot of people have very low interest rates. And so they're just sitting on their properties. And so you haven't seen that drop. But in the multifamily space, property values have dropped anywhere from 15 to 30%, depending on the market. That is a risk with syndications. Now, how do you mitigate the risk? Because it's all about de-risking. When you do due diligence, what you're looking at is how do I make sure I'm reducing or eliminating risk in my deals, right? The difference, and so this is where you've seen capital calls where people need to put capital into the deals to hold on to the deals. And you've probably also heard stories where some investor capital has been completely wiped off and they just had to let go of the deal, right? Now, the difference over here is your ability to hold on to the deal. The thing with real estate is it's all about your time in the market, right? Over time, a good deal becomes great and a bad deal becomes good. So this scenario where property prices have gone down, as interest rates start dropping, property prices will go up again, right? So this is just, if you look historically over, say, the last 50 years, multifamily prices have not necessarily dropped a lot significantly until '07 and '08. But again, this is another scenario where prices have dropped. They will eventually go up because real estate is inflation correlated. Now, the loss actually happens when you're forced to sell the asset at an inopportune time. So as long as you're able to hold on to the asset, everybody will be able to recoup their investment. You may actually make a profit, right? So the difference then is in the ability to hold on to a deal. And so if you're trying to look at deals today, well, there are two real different scenarios, but if you were purchasing an asset in 21 and 2022, which is when we were at the peak of the market, the difference between deals that will be able to make it and will do well, as opposed to deals where investors will lose capital, is in the ability to hold on to the deal. And that is based on two things majorly. One is going to be debt, the kind of debt product that was put on the deal. So if they had short-term debt with variable interest rates and they were forced to refinance or sell right now because it's the end of their loan term, then a lot of people are going to be forced to sell at a time when property values are lower and investors lose capital. But if you have the right kind of debt product on them and you're able to hold on to the deal, then most people will do great, right? So it's the debt product is one thing. The other is going to be, is it an asset that was cash flowing and was doing well from the beginning? So was occupancy great? Were the sponsors able to execute the business plan and increase the net operating income from the property? Because as long as you have positive cash flow and positive income, that affects the asset value, but it also affects your ability to hold on to the deal. So those are the things that are going to make a difference. I think the third thing is going to be the sophistication of the sponsor. And so again, in the same environment, there are those sponsors who aren't able to navigate this, and there are people who are able to go in and restructure the loans, or they're able to pump capital into the deal, either through, getting preferred equity partners or because they have access to capital. That's another thing that makes a difference. And so for anyone looking at deals today, we're in a very different environment, Disha. The market cycle, we were at the peak in March 2022. Right now, we're really close to the bottom of the market cycle and we're trended upwards. As soon as interest rates start dropping, asset values are going to go up again. So anyone looking at assets right now, this is the time where everyone's most concerned, but it's also the time where you have the least risk in the market and the most opportunity. March 2022 was when people were so optimistic about investing in real estate, but that was the riskiest time with the least opportunity. A, remember that. But B, as you're doing your due diligence right now, a great question to ask sponsors is how their deals that they entered into between the second half of 2021 and the first half of 2022 are doing, what their business plan for that is. And that's going to give you a good indication of the kind of sponsor you're working with.
A lot of great nuggets of information there. We talked about the type of debt that they're taking out. Now, is that something that you are privy to as a limited partner when you're looking at a syndication?
Absolutely. And that's an important question to be asking. I usually tell people if you're evaluating a deal, there are 3 steps to it, right? The first thing is, A, you need to be very clear about what your criteria is. So I tell people, and we actually have a guide. If anyone's looking, it's a free guide. It's generationalwealthmd.com/guide in lowercase, which goes over all the steps that you as a limited partner need to know to invest wisely in syndications. But the first thing is going to be knowing what your buy box is, right? Because otherwise you could be looking at every deal that comes your way and it's shiny object syndrome. You're going to lose focus. You really need to know what your priority is. How long do you need the deal to be? How important is liquidity to you? Are you okay with a deal that is going to have a 5-year hold period versus a 10-year hold period? What is more important? Is cash flow more important to you, or is velocity of growth of capital more important to you? And that's going to be different depending on your stage in life, right? So Disha, for you today, you may want your capital to double every 5 years. That may be more important. 10 years down the line, you may want to cut back in medicine. You'll say, I want more cash flow hitting my bank account every month because I'm going to live off of it, right? So being clear about that, and then knowing where you sit on the risk return spectrum. Anyone going into ground up development, that's higher risk, higher return. And everyone has a different aptitude. For some of you, you may want to have steady cash flow as you go into the deal. You may want to go into like an apartment that's already 95% occupied, which spits out cash flow every month. But there's a business plan to, renovate the properties and increase the value of the property and kind of double your money in 5 years. So that's lower risk. It's still moderate return. So identifying where you want to be on that spectrum is really important. So build your buy box first. But then as you go and you evaluate the deal, you're looking at the market. Is it a great market to be investing in? And there are multiple things you look at to identify market demographics. Is it something that fits your buy box? Then you look at the sponsor. Do they have a great track record? Are their interests aligned with mine? What kind of fees do they charge? How do they get paid? All of that is important. But eventually looking at the individual deal is going to be really important too, where you're going to look at the debt that they have on the deal, and they have to provide you with all of that information. And if that's not easily available, you have the ability to ask them for even their detailed underwriting, which goes into all the assumptions that are in the deal that you may not see on the initial slide deck that they provide you with, but it'll have specifics about the deal. I think it's very important for people to have an understanding, a basic understanding of, what the debt looks like. What does the property look like today? Is it going to cash flow day one? Is it pretty much occupied? What is our business plan? Are we going and taking it from 80% occupancy to 90%? What are we assuming rent growth is going to be like? And what are those assumptions we're putting in that you can make anything look shiny and attractive and spit out a 20% return depending on your assumptions, right? So really deep diving into those assumptions. And it's not as complex as it seems. It's probably 5 questions for each of those categories. So 15 in all. But I think it's important, even as a limited partner or a passive investor, to kind of know what your buy box is and know important questions to ask. At the end of the day, vetting the deal and the market is going to be less important than vetting the sponsor. Because if you have a good sponsor, then you can trust them to pick the right market, to pick the right deal and execute the business plan. So vetting the sponsor is going to be the most important thing.
And how do you do that? How do you vet the sponsor?
Okay, so 2 parts to that, right? And again, this is all outlined in the guide with very specific questions. But the first thing you're going to do is identify their track record, right? And then the second part is alignment of interest. But important questions to ask is, do they have a long track record? What do their returns look like? If they don't, do they work with people who have a long track record? What are the criteria they look at when they start building these partnerships? What is their buy box? And does that fit your buy box essentially, right? And then I think important questions to ask are, did they ever hold distributions or do a capital call on any of their deals? If there ever was a time when things went wrong, why they think that happened and what did they do to mitigate the situation? That really tells you a lot about their work ethics and how they show up as a sponsor. And I think that's really important. Another thing I like to see is someone who has a reputation, right? Is someone who has a reputation to protect, because it takes years to build a reputation. It takes seconds to lose it. And so they're very focused on their investors. They're very focused on the brand per se. And so it's always helpful to work with someone like that. But really, I feel they have important questions about their returns that they've given people. And again, if you're talking to sponsors right now, I just cannot highlight how important it is to ask them how their deals that they acquired in 2021 and 2022 are doing in terms of distributions going out to investors, if those are paused, why, and what their business plan is to get those assets to the other side and what they're doing to support their investors. So that's as far as the track record goes. Now, the second part of that is going to be alignment of interest. So as you're vetting sponsors, it's important to ask them. This is, I think, less important than the track record, but how do they get paid? What are the fees involved? And when the property spits out returns on a monthly basis, do they get to participate in that? Or does it, oftentimes there's something called a preferred return. So your investors are getting all the cash flow from the property, and the general partners don't necessarily get to partake in that until they hit a certain metric, right? So a lot of it is performance based. So when they do well, that's when they get to participate in it. And same thing at exit. Oftentimes, and this varies, there are different splits, and industry standard is typically about 70-30, which means that when you sell the property, when there's profit, the limited partners get about 70% of the profit, and the general partners get about 30%. That's on the back end. And again, that's after they've returned investor capital, after they've hit the preferred return, often for cash flow for the duration of the hold. And so after all of that is met, that is when the profits are split, right? So oftentimes that is a way to incentivize the general partners to make sure that they do really well in the deal, because a lot of their profit is on the back end. So understanding that structure really helps you identify if you're working with people where interests are aligned and they get paid more when they perform better, as opposed to, say, having a sponsor who will split the cash flow with you from day one, which means that if you're getting 5% cash flow from the property, they get about half of that, as opposed to giving your investors a certain number that they need to hit before you start, splitting the profit. So really understanding all of that helps you identify this kind of sponsor you're working with. But again, taking it back to the bigger picture thing, the track record of the sponsor and their brand and reputation are probably the most important things to focus on.
So are all syndications like 5 or 10-year deals where you sell in 5 to 10 years, which sounds like a pretty short turnaround period to me as a buy and hold real estate investor? What is the reasoning behind that?
So that's a great question, Disha. Now, like I said, there's a risk return spectrum, right? And you get to decide where you want to be on the spectrum. Now, the reason hold period is important, and you need to identify what your liquidity needs are. The longer you hold an asset, what happens is that the initial rehab and value add, okay? So with multifamily, the asset value is dependent on the income from the property, right? So when you acquire the property for the first time and you're buying it and you're operating it more efficiently and you're reducing your expenses, you're actually increasing your net operating income, right? Because that's the difference between income and expenses. So operational efficiencies. And when you do rehabs and you increase the property value, you increase the rent from the property, you're increasing the property value simultaneously. But that income bump is most significant in the first 2 years that you acquire the property and execute your business plan, right? And it's a curve that starts dropping down pretty quickly after the first 2 years. So the most bump in income is seen in the first 2 years of acquisition. And that's where you're having the highest returns. The longer you hold a property, your returns from the property start muting, because after that, what you're relying on is inflation-related income growth, which then translates to property value increase, right? The question you ask yourself is, when you have longer hold periods, the advantage of longer hold periods, so if it's a 10-year or 20-year hold, is that reduces risk, right? Because the sponsor is likely getting a debt product that's going to be able to weather the storm better. So there's lower risk over there, but there is lower return. So it's on the lower risk, lower return part of the spectrum. That may make sense for some people, but for people who are looking to really accelerate to financial freedom, that's not going to make the most sense. Now, another thing is that, for a sponsor, once you've stabilized the asset and you've actually done the rehabs and operationally you've stabilized it, it's easier to hold on to the property long term, right? There's more work involved in exiting a property and entering another property and then stabilizing it. It's the same thing. That's the effort return spectrum. The more work you put in, your returns are higher. And so it just goes to say that with those shorter hold periods, that's the only way to give investors like a 20% average annualized return. And that's because we're going in, executing the business plan, doing the value add and exiting. The longer your hold period, your returns get muted, but your risk gets lowered. And so I think it's an important question for everyone to think about. What makes the most sense for me? And again, it may be a different answer for you today as you're looking to really accelerate to generate more meaningful passive income, as opposed to say 20 years down the line when you're in cruise control mode and you're like, you know what, I have all the income coming in, your appetite for risk shifts. So decide where you want to be, but that's the reason. The longer hold periods mute returns. The highest return is seen in the first 2 years of asset acquisition because that's when you're going in and you're rehabbing. And my take is that when you're a limited partner, you've already given up a significant portion of your returns because you're passive in the deal. So I'd probably want my general partners to be active, to go in and do that work so that I'm still able to get that 20% average annualized return, as opposed to having them stay passive in it and still get the same split. So that's the way I look at it. And again, it's going to be different for different individuals and different for you at different phases of your life. But that's where I think it's important to make intentional choices.
Yeah. And I guess part of the risk is if you're in a 5-year deal and you're in an interest rate environment like right now, and the 5-year debt is ending and you have to refinance at this point, that's when you see that risk really actualize.
One point about that, though, Disha, is that if you had an asset that you acquired in, say, 2019, and you're now at the end of that 5-year period and you have to refinance, you will have no issues refinancing, right? You still have the ability to refinance and hold it because anything acquired in 2019, you've still seen the rent bumps, the inflation. We had a period of massive inflation between 2020 and 2021. So your property values have increased significantly and you're not in any distress. So you're able to refinance. The distress is only for assets acquired between mid 2021 and early 2022 because they didn't really benefit from that inflation related rent growth, but they got hit with the massive interest rate increases. So it's that 1 year period where the assets are struggling. But otherwise, typically, if you've held on to an asset, you are often in a position to refinance, even if your plan was to hold it for 5 years, but it's not a good time to sell. Because of inflation, you're often in a position to refinance and just put on another maybe 3-year debt product on it or another 5-year debt product on it, depending on what your business plan is. Or you can even modify your current loan and ask for an extension for a couple of years to weather it out.
What are some tax implications of investing in syndications? Like, what should LPs be expecting every year and then when the property sells?
Yeah, so that's another great question because, we're talking about tax efficiencies here, right? So the first thing is that if you were to purchase your own asset, it's very similar to that, right? You do get something called bonus depreciation. So what does that mean? When you purchase real estate, the IRS allows you to depreciate a part of the building basis annually. So suppose I purchased something, just to make it simple, for $400,000, about 25% of that is land, right? So that's $100,000 that you don't get to depreciate. But the rest of the $300,000 is building basis. And the IRS allows you to go ahead and depreciate that over, say, let's talk about just a single family home, right? 27 and a half years. It's different for commercial, that's 39 years. But so you take that $300,000 and depreciate it over 27 and a half years. Is that about close to $10,000 annually, I believe? That's what you land at. Now, what happens with bonus depreciation is that anything that has a useful life less than 20 years, you get to take all of that depreciation, that paper loss. It's actually a paper loss. You're actually getting cash flow hitting your bank account, but on paper you have a loss, right? You can take that up front. So same thing with an apartment. So just to give you an example of a deal we're in currently in Atlanta, if you invest $100,000 in 2024, when you get your tax return for 2024, on there you will have about 80,000 of paper losses, right? So you'll see 80,000 in losses. Now, that's really beneficial because what it does is that when you have cash flow from the property, suppose you have $5,000 or $7,000 a month of cash flow hitting your bank account, it's not going to show as positive income because even if it's passive income, you have to pay taxes based on your marginal tax bracket, which is 50% for anyone living in California. And for most of the people, it's pretty close to 50%, right? So you'd have to pay taxes on it. But because you have those passive losses sitting in your passive loss bucket, you don't have to pay taxes on the income that you generate from the property, right? There's multiple implications to it. So let me see how I want to break this down. Now, the question a lot of people ask is, can I use those losses against my W-2 income? So you cannot use it against active income, right? Those are passive losses. They sit in the passive bucket. Active income is your W-2 or 1099 income. Now, there are unique situations in which if you or your spouse have real estate professional status, you may be able to use those losses against your active income. But for most people, that's not the case. But if you do have additional passive income, suppose you have a short-term rental or a long-term rental that's throwing out positive passive income after depreciation, then you can use it to offset that income, right? So then your ROI is actually significantly higher than it would be for someone who doesn't have passive income. If you're a physician who owns practice buildings or has an ownership interest in the real estate or business part of your practice, but you're not materially participating in it, that income hits your bank account as passive income. So if you have any other source of passive income, those passive losses can be used to offset that passive income, right? So that's what you can use it against, and you're using it against the cash flow hitting your bank account. Now, the second part of the question is what happens during sale. So when I sell that property, what happens? Now, you have something called depreciation recapture and long-term capital gains that will hit you. But real estate being real estate, there are ways to defer taxes, right? And so the advantage of real estate is that you're able to defer taxes if you own real estate directly or you own them through syndications. The whole point is to keep kicking that tax implication down the road. And then hopefully when your heirs inherit the assets, there's something called step up in basis, and all of that tax implication is completely wiped out. Now, how does that work with syndications? If I own a property, I can do something called a 1031 exchange, right? And I have absolute control over it. With syndications, you don't own the real estate. You have an ownership stake in the real estate. Therefore, you cannot sell an asset and then directly 1031 that into another asset like a single family home. The entire LLC needs to 1031 into a separate asset. And most sophisticated sponsors will give you the ability to do that when you exit a deal with them, right? So the entire LLC will 1031. You have the ability to participate in it, or you have the ability to stay out of it. So that's how you keep deferring taxes. Now, one more unique situation that I want to touch upon while we're talking about this is something called the lazy 1031. At the time of this recording, so mid-April 2024, we will know if 100% bonus depreciation is extended till 2026. Now, if that gets extended, even if it doesn't, we have 60% bonus depreciation. So as long as we have bonus depreciation, what you can do is if you sell a property this year and you have tax implications from both depreciation recapture and capital gains, but you enter into another deal and you have losses from that deal, then the losses from the new deal you're getting into can offset the tax implications you have from the deal that you're exiting. So that's a lazy 1031. You don't necessarily need to follow the strict guidelines of the 1031. You don't have to stick with the same sponsor and 1031 along with them into the next deal. It gives you a lot of flexibility. So for people listening, as long as we have bonus depreciation, there is a way to engage in what's called a lazy 1031. It's a good question to ask your CPA. Make sure you're understanding it correctly for your situation, but that is another option that gives you a lot of flexibility. And so it just makes it more attractive to invest in syndications.
That's amazing. So lots of different ways to handle the tax implications of this rapid growth that you're having. That's part of the magic of real estate investing in the United States is because it's so heavily tax subsidized, really. Do you bonus depreciate or accelerated depreciate all of your properties when you buy them?
So most sponsors do that because, again, it's beneficial to a lot of investors if they're either exiting another deal or if they have other passive income hitting their buckets, or just to offset the taxes that they would otherwise be paying on their distributions. And so most syndicators will, tap into it, and then you will see bonus depreciation on the syndications you're entering into at this time.
Param, you mentioned buy box earlier. Or ask about a syndicator's buy box. What is your buy box?
So at this time, Risha, we've stuck to really strong markets, preferably in the Sun Belt, which tend to see, I call them hybrid markets because they have decent cash flow and they also have good appreciation over time. So we've stuck to the Sun Belt markets. Occasionally, we do venture into Midwest markets, which are also landlord friendly. They have higher cash flow, right? And so we've stuck to those markets. We like stabilized value add deals where, again, like I said, on the risk return spectrum, there's smack in the middle. There's calculated risk, but there are moderate returns. I feel like that's a good fit for most people because it gives you the ability to kind of double your money in 5 years across market cycles. So, and another thing that you look at when you're assessing risk is the class of property. We've stuck to A- and B+ properties. In the past, we've probably done B-, but the more we do this, I feel like, again, being very intentional about the risk we assume in our portfolio is important. So those are the kind of assets we like to invest in. And even within that, we have two different kinds of investment share classes. A, for people who are lower risk and just want more cash flow, and then class B for people who care more about velocity of growth. But that's our typical buy box at this time. Now, we are looking at different asset classes, like car washes and ATMs, and maybe even a short-term rental fund, which can give people more heavy cash flow during the hold period and more depreciation benefits with ATMs. Because I think for some people that can be more beneficial. And so we may be adding that into our portfolio. We're also looking at debt funds right now because this is a time where you could go into a debt position in some of these assets and with a significantly lower risk, but getting the same returns that you would with equity positions. So we're looking at some debt funds that we may be getting into this year. So just the areas where we're looking to grow. But I think our bread and butter is your stabilized value add, A minus, B plus apartments in hybrid markets across the Sun Belt.
Sounds like a solid strategy. Can you define a debt fund for us?
When we talk about most syndications, we're talking about equity positions, right? So we have a lender who gets the debt product, and then the investors are putting their capital in as equity, right? And so we don't get a fixed return that is guaranteed, but we get to partake in the cash flow, which is what hits our bank accounts every month. And we also get to participate in the profit on the back end, right? So it's an equity position. It's like when you go and buy a home, you put down 25%, the lender puts in 75%, and they get paid first no matter what, whenever the property is sold, right? But they get fixed returns, and your return varies depending on the performance of the property. It's the same thing. So most investors, when you go into syndications, you are in an equity position where you get to partake in the profits, and you don't have like a fixed return like a lender does. A debt fund is where, you have assets that are doing really well right now, but they actually need a small infusion of capital to give them the ability to give the sponsors the ability to hold on to the asset for the next few years till the market condition improves. When you take a debt position, it's either preferred equity or debt position, but you're sitting right next to the lender on the capital stack. So in this case, the lender gets paid first, but right after the lender, you're the person who gets paid before any of the investors who have an equity position get paid. Your risk is significantly lower just because of your position in the capital stack. And you probably have more defined returns, right? So some of the deals we're looking at are about 12% current. So you're getting about 12% returns hitting your bank account every month. That's what we're expecting. And then we're probably also negotiating some percentage of profit share on the back end. It's lower risk just because of where you are on the capital stack. So you get paid right after the lender. And if it's a solid deal, then there's very, very low risk in it. But it's also, I would say 3 years ago, you could not expect that return for a debt position, right? And it's only because there's such a requirement for capital and interest rates are so high right now that we're actually able to get those higher returns. So there's a short window just because of where we are in the economic cycle, where we're able to get into those lower risk deals with equity type of returns, what we've typically seen in the equity space. I think it's a good fit for people who are risk averse and who love seeing cash flow hit their bank accounts. We may be able to see up to 20% or higher average annualized returns on this product, but that's what we're exploring and doing our due diligence on right now to make sure we're getting into, the right kind of fund. But I think people like to be opportunistic. I would say in the next 12 to 18 months, that's probably a location where you're able to get significantly lower risk and still see those high returns.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. It sounds to me like the difference between investing in stocks versus bonds, or stocks, you kind of own the company.
Correct. Except now suddenly you're getting stock-like returns in bonds, which
right.
is unheard of.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I defined how many units you have, but tell us a little bit about the properties you own currently yourself and in your syndications.
Yeah, absolutely. So my individual portfolio is mostly based locally in Bakersfield, California and Houston, Texas. And I call it a small and mighty portfolio. So I started off with, single family homes and townhomes. And internationally, I have some apartment complexes that I own, some ground up developments. But that's my personal portfolio that kind of takes care of my needs. Within GW Capital, like I said, we have apartments, and kind of hard to keep track of the numbers, but we're over 1,000 units at this point, and they're scattered across Phoenix, Arizona. We have 4 different properties in Atlanta, and then we have Greenville, South Carolina, and then one in Indiana. And so we're underwriting very seriously in Dallas, which I think is another really strong market. So like I said, we love the Sun Belt for the hybrid potential where we're getting significant cash flow, even in this environment where interest rates are high, where we're targeting assets where our investors get at least 4 to 5% cash flow in the first year of hold. And then that increases over time. And that's what we're looking at. We're underwriting deals. This is a great time. Like I said, lots of opportunity in the market for anyone looking. If you've sat on the sidelines because you're concerned about risk, this is the time to jump in, because we're getting assets for significant discounts. We're currently in a deal where this must have been worth 65 to 70 million at the peak of the market in March 2022. We're acquiring it for $52 million. So significantly discounted assets, but still seeing heavy cash flow in these deals. So that's what our portfolio looks like. We're looking to expand into more large MSAs with strong demographics. So Dallas is one we're looking at, possibly going to be looking at some markets in Florida, but that's what we're doing right now.
not only do you have your real estate business, tell us about the other things that you're doing.
GW Gives is our nonprofit. And for me, it was after I hit financial freedom. My big why at that time was time for connection with my family. I felt like I needed a stronger why to keep me going. And I love the impact that we have with Generational Wealth MD and GW Capital. It's just amazing what we get to hear in the stories. But I wanted it to mean something more. And so we help children in rural India with disabilities with their healthcare and education needs, because that's where I've seen the greatest inequity. And it's mostly centered around Coimbatore. We work with the government hospital and early intervention centers. So that's where I'm from. My parents were from 2 little villages over there, and I want to stay connected, but I also want to give back. The communities help us support our mission.
Wow, Param, that's so great that you're doing that and so inspiring. I mean, you really, I remember meeting you at some conferences a few years ago and talking to you, and it just seems like you've just grown exponentially and really just showing everyone how much you can do with a determined mind and a smart brain. If you can get through all the details and get over the fear, I mean, it's amazing what you've done.
Thank you, Disha. And like you said, these conferences are so critical to our growth. I remember also, where I started, and I feel like we're just getting started. Now I have coaches, performance coaches, and the people in the community are just like great partners, people I learn from. And I think for anyone listening, I just love what you're doing, right? Because just exposing people to ideas, help them see what's possible. And everything that is amazing and seems impossible started with a dream. When you see what's possible, I think the things that we can do, they will just blow our mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us, to teach us, and share your journey with us. I'm so thankful.
Thank you, Disha. This was amazing.
That's all for today, friends. A huge thank you to Dr. Param Baladandapani for joining us and sharing her journey from financial uncertainty to becoming a real estate powerhouse. I hope through this episode you've gained a better understanding of real estate syndications, the good and the bad. Whether you decide to invest in syndications or not, stories like her remind us why we're on this quest for financial freedom. To practice medicine because we love it, not just because our bank accounts demand it. And then to give back and support our communities and the causes we really care about. Remember, it's never too late to rewrite your financial destiny. I'm Dr. Disha Spath, and you've been listening to Finding Financial Freedom with the Frugal Physician. Stay curious, stay driven, and let's make those money moves happen. Until next time, stay frugal, y'all.
The content shared on this podcast should not be taken as individualized financial advice. We are here to share our knowledge and experiences, but it is crucial to consult with professionals such as accountants, financial advisors, or attorneys who can provide personalized guidance based on your specific needs.